Thank you, Barbara, for that intro. Thank you, Ellie, for the invitation, and all of you here at the National Task Force. We're so excited to be here. It's an honor not only to be here and hear such amazing speakers, but to moderate with our superstar, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. I was recently on a call with you with very interesting people, and everybody talks about your book and everything that happened with the universities, which actually I feel is the culmination of a lot of work that happened before that. And so I want to begin with you telling us a little bit about who was Elise Stefanik in college, what was your role, and how did that propel you to who you are today?
Well, thank you so much, Tila. Thank you to Ellie for the invitation. Thank you to Barbara Feingold, a dear friend and longtime supporter and really such an extraordinary leader. I look around the room and there are so many familiar faces, people who I've had the opportunity to meet in my home state of New York, but really across the country, and just grateful for your service, for your advocacy on an incredibly important issue for who we are as Americans and also protecting American national security and standing up for American families and our values. So Tila, thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about my book, Poisoned Ivies. It's not a traditional political book in that many elected officials sort of write their life story. What I do talk about, which is what you asked, is my educational background and my upbringing that helped position me on the House Education Committee to really hold these higher education institutions accountable. I'm born and raised in upstate New York. I have two great parents that were small business owners. They really invested in my brother and my upbringing. I went to an independent all-girls day school. It was right next door to a synagogue. I had many Jewish friends growing up. I myself am Catholic. My mom's Italian-American, my dad's Polish-American. And I was the first member of my immediate family to have the opportunity to graduate from college. I graduated from Harvard, but I think what is more of the achievement, rather than graduating from Harvard, is maintaining my moral values with which I was raised. And thank you for that. While an undergrad, I was very involved in sort of learning about public policy, was very interested in national security. And at the time, this was over 20 years ago, of course the school was left-leaning, but it was not what we are seeing today. It was unrecognizable for me to see post-October 7th what was happening at our most elite higher education institutions. And I think because of that experience, Tila, having currently as an alumna, but having been a student there, to be able to ask very well-informed questions because of that personal educational journey helped me make an impact and reset the course for higher education and really hold these failed university leaders accountable.
If I'm not mistaken, I remember you saying something about being a leader, and because you were a conservative leader, you were automatically sidelined. So there was something that was going on in the universities 20 years ago that led to where we are today. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, there were certain kernels that were indicators of the direction, and we all know this. Higher education has lurched very far to the left outside of the mainstream. When I was an undergrad, I'll give you an example. My senior year, I went to a career panel. It was run by the university. It was not partisan, and it was talking about jobs in national security. So they had the Department of Homeland Security, they had the FBI, the CIA, they had a few think tanks, they had Booz Allen, just an educational panel. And a radical leftist group, they didn't protest, they took over, they silenced the panelists, and they called themselves protester. One of those individuals physically made themselves vomit all over the floor to shut down the panel. The university didn't handle it appropriately. I, as a senior, went back to my dorm room. I wrote an op-ed that ran in the Crimson called Political Vomit, and it was picked up by the Wall Street Journal. So that was my first foray in seeing the really radical left that are taking over university spaces. The other experience I had was as a member of Congress. I had been appointed because I was an alumna and had been involved in the quote-unquote bipartisan institute of politics. I was removed very publicly and forced to, I didn't resign, they removed me from this board because of my support for President Trump. I was the only person on the board who voted for President Trump. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. None of them voted for him once, but I did in 16, 2020, and 2024, and then was removed after the 2020 election based upon statements I made on the House floor focused on constitutional and election integrity issue. But it shows the double standard of Harvard, because a few years later, we saw, of course, their fundamental just failure of leadership when it came to addressing the rise of anti-Semitism on campuses. So they've had a history of canceling left conservative speech and trying to appease these increasingly radical forces that are anti-American, frankly.
Which is so interesting, really, because you would expect that the people who are the professors and the leaders of higher education, which are the smart people in society, would know better, would understand the difference between right and wrong, and what you talk about in your book as the moral rot. And so tell us about what you uncovered and what you call the moral rot within these institutions, and how would you describe it, and how did it get there?
Well, to remind you about the hearing, which really exposed the moral rot, I'm sure many of you have seen the hearing, probably a few different times, watched that clip. This was a day-long hearing. You had the presidents of MIT, Penn, and Harvard, and I had asked questions throughout the hearing, many rounds of questions. I struggled to get direct answers because they didn't want to address their failure of leadership. And I thought to myself, how can I ask a question that's a straightforward moral one, not a political question, in the most simplest terms possible? And the question was this: does calling for the genocide of Jews violate your university's code of conduct? I assumed they would say yes, and I was planning on following up, what disciplinary action have you taken against those that broke the rules? To my shock, one after the other said, it depends on the context. And what was deeply concerning, in addition to their answer, was they didn't think anything was wrong with that answer. They stood up and they were celebrating how well they thought the hearing went. Luckily, it was publicly available because of C-SPAN. And I'll note, there was no media at this point of the hearing. It was just the C-SPAN footage that caught on like wildfire in terms of how did we get to this point where the leaders of these most prestigious institutions are so deeply, they've been rotted out, and this is not fundamentally our American values. So how did we get to this moral rot? I think it's a number of issues, and it's happened over time. It didn't happen overnight. You have to look at the foreign influences in our higher education system, billions of dollars that are flowing into these institutions from Qatar, from CCP, from other countries that are counter to our American values. You also have to look at the percentage of foreign students, and I talk about this in the case of Columbia in particular. 40% of the student body at Columbia are not Americans, and if you look at some of those that were organizing the pro-Hamas encampments, they were on a foreign visa. They needed to be deported then. Thank goodness we had a shift in the administration, and in the Trump administration, they are being deported, and we're enforcing the law. The other piece here is the faculty and this faculty tenure, where you've had an increasingly self-selection of very monolithic viewpoints that are radicalized to the left and outside of the norm. The book does a deep dive in the poisoned Ivies, but it also highlights schools that are getting it right. So there are bright spots in this, Tila.
So talking about the schools that are getting it right, there are many schools that are getting it right. It happens to be a trend among the Ivies that are getting it wrong, although Dartmouth, I believe, is getting it very right. And I recently heard from the president of Dartmouth, and she said, we don't tolerate hate. It's as simple as that. And whatever that means, whether it's with the students or the professors, they're doing something about it. And so we see that the hate crimes really have risen since October 7th, are at an all-time high. Anti-Semitism is at an all-time high. You did a deep dive into many universities that got it wrong. That's very clear. And I feel like there was a trend that was coming from before, that if you were paying attention, people were passing the anti-BDS laws under the auspices, again, of freedom of speech or whatever they wanted to classify, but it was hate. It was very, very targeted hate towards Jewish students. They would hold these votes at NYU to pass a BDS law on a Friday night or on a Jewish holiday. So we saw the trend before October 7th, but after October 7th, something happened. And this trend that we see at Columbia, and especially in New York, rose in anti-Semitism and created a very hostile environment for the Jewish students. So tell us what you think caused it and how you think we got there, specifically at these universities.
It happened over time. As I said, this did not happen overnight. This was a period of decades. I point out the foreign funding. I also point out this DEI agenda, which at its core is anti-Semitic. And I give an example of the case of Harvard. You had, prior to October 7th, a number of students, Jewish students, who reached out to the Office of DEI at Harvard, who at that point were concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism. They didn't even get a response from the Office of DEI. I also believe in the admissions process, and we're seeing this play out with some of the DOJ investigations ongoing currently, that there has been anti-Semitism in the admissions process. If you look at the precipitous decline of the percentage of Jewish students on campus. And then the faculty, as I said, have become increasingly radicalized and outside of the norm. You pointed out some of the positive examples. I do highlight Dartmouth as an outlier among the Ivy League. What Dartmouth did differently was they enforced the rules immediately. They cleared out the pro-Hamas encampment. They ensured that there were actual consequences when students or others broke the rules of the university. And they had zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. And you also mentioned sort of the BDS initiatives. These have been growing on these universities for a number of years, specifically targeted against Israel and specifically targeted against Jewish students. And I want to anticipate, oftentimes some of the critics of my work will say to me, well, what about freedom of speech? Let me tell you, and this came up in the hearing, each one of these universities ranks F when it comes to freedom of speech. They only vociferously want to hide underneath this protection of freedom of speech when it comes for calling for the genocide of Jews. That is hate, that is un-American, and there needs to be consequences. And I always point out, these were physical assaults, these were targeting of students, these were drawing of swastikas on student dorm rooms, of having checkpoints going from their dorm to their classroom. It should never happen anywhere in the world at any time, but it should certainly never happen in the United States of America in modern day times.
You specifically mentioned the Jewish students, the Jewish parents, the Jewish faculty. It happens to be that a lot of these universities have the name of Jewish donors on the building, and exactly those buildings are the ones that the Jews were either being locked out of or even protested against, right in front of the names of those people that had donated to the schools. So tell me what you think. When you say that parents are scared to send their kids to school, you see that there's a decline in Jewish kids going to certain universities, and you see that the parents are afraid. Should they be afraid or should they fight back? What would you recommend, not just to the parents, but also to the students or even the faculty? We see the hate, we see the anti-Semitism. They can very easily move to Florida. Governor DeSantis.
Many have.
Governor DeSantis has actually made an announcement to all of the Florida schools when this happened, that anybody that wanted to transfer from the Northeast to Florida schools, it would be a very seamless and easy transition. And many did come down to Florida. We see UF now became the new Ivy. But should we ignore the Ivies? Should we invest again in the Ivies? Should we be scared? Should we fight back? What's your recommendation?
My recommendation is we have to do both. We have to support these sort of newer up-and-coming institutions that are growing, that are more reflective of American values. But the reason why I say we can't totally give up on these institutions, and this was a part of writing this book that was very informative and I think interesting from my perspective. If you go back to the founding mission, Harvard was founded in 1636. Its motto today is Veritas, truth in Latin. The founding motto was Veritas et Christo et Ecclesiae, truth in Christ and the church. To me, that means a moral truth. And Harvard has lost its way. But remember, it was founded in 1636, was very much a part prior to the founding of our nation. The same goes for Penn. Benjamin Franklin was one of the visionaries that modeled what Penn is today. And Columbia, I also point to as well. Alexander Hamilton, an early student of King's College before it became Columbia University. He was one of the original trustees, and famous Hamilton Hall, which the pro-Hamas rioters took over, was named after Alexander Hamilton. These institutions are important historically, so I argue in the book they need to return to their founding mission, and it's going to take, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take vigilance over many years, not just from policymakers, but from donors, from alumni, from students, from parents on holding these universities to their initial founding mission. That's not to say, Tila, though, as I think about it, my son is 4, he's only starting kindergarten this September, so we have quite some time before higher education. I really think through, as a parent, the institutions that we will send him to make sure that they're reflective of our values in which we want to raise him.
My daughter's sitting right there. She was applying to colleges 5 years ago. I said exactly those words. You cannot apply to schools that go against the values that we have raised you on and are going to teach you to hate everything that we raised you to love, which is God and country, and to be proud of your Jewish identity. And that was before we knew all this. So now that we know, and it's so transparent, at least we have people like you that brought it to the forefront. I believe you said that you weren't originally on the education committee, or it was a small committee.
The education committee, when I was first elected, you get to kind of rank the committees. Right. I was the only Republican who put the education committee. I put armed services and education. Now it's viewed as one of the sort of most sought after committees because not only of that hearing, but the impact that you can make and the attention that is given, not just on the higher ed educational issues, but K through 12 as well.
I believe also because of the funding. And so we spoke about how there has to be consequence, and we spoke about how we need to think about where our dollars are going, where our kids are going, and even the faculty that should have some sort of consequence. But we need to talk about the funding, right? We have the government funding many of these institutions that are indoctrinating our children and the next generation of leaders to hate their country. And so we see that there is a consequence and money being taken away from those institutions. How do we redirect that money and help it get to the good institutions that we want to reward? And I can tell you, I work with local universities in South Florida, and the ADL, which we have some opinions pro and against, but the ADL gave a rating to universities on how they treated their Jewish students and how they dealt with anti-Semitism on campus. And FIU, which I'm on the board, got an A. And then we also know that Ohio State got an A. So Bernie Moreno, our senator, who we love, and his wife is here, Bridget, he came to the university and they spoke about doing some kind of roundtable and not just putting down the people that didn't get an A, but how do we encourage others to get an A? And on that same note, how do we reward those that are doing the same thing by taking away the funding but allocating it to where we think our dollars should be going and where we would want our children to go to school?
Well, let me take a step back further, Tila, in that the decision to withhold the funds was absolutely critical, and it was something that we had been advocating for. If you look back, remember, the hearing happened in December of 2023. You had a year left of the failed Biden administration where they took no action. There were no investigations launched by the Department of Education, no investigations by the Department of Justice. What did these schools do? These schools stuck their heads in the sand and continued to dig deeper and deeper into this moral abyss. It was only a shift in the approach when you had a shift in the administration when on day one, and my office helped craft the executive orders that President Trump signed. Those were extremely important to strengthen protection for American Jewish students on these campuses. And you also had a number of investigations that were launched by the Department of Ed and DOJ. This was just after the previous admin said, oh, we can't do that because there's outside litigation. We know that's not the case. You need to do both. Have the outside litigation of the students who were victims as well as hold them accountable. So I wanted to just back up because that's an important point to make regarding the funding. The withholding is the greatest tool we have to make sure these schools are complying with the law. I argue that many of them are not complying with civil rights protection for Jewish students on campus, and they need to. I think the settlements that are being negotiated in terms of as was negotiated by Columbia, some of those discussions are ongoing. That is a way to rein these schools in. But my fear is some of these schools want to try to drag this out until after President Trump's second term. It is our job in Congress to codify as many of these executive orders as possible to solve this issue for the long term. And you mentioned, I want to just remember everything you said, you mentioned the great new senator from Ohio, Bernie Moreno, who is a superstar on this and many issues, and it's great to have his wife here.
So if we go back to the laws and the ability to be able to pass laws that will stick and will stay beyond this administration, I've heard of laws that are banning or limiting banning certain countries and limiting students
I've
from
introduced
certain
them.
countries.
I'm the one that introduced them.
We know that there are laws that have to do with funding, and we know that there are laws that have to do with specific tenure of certain universities, but again, that's a case by case. So if you can implement immediately 3 of those or 3 things that need to be done right now that maybe we can advocate for or we can help push forward and make calls to our elected officials, what would they be?
So one is called the Deterrent Act. We've passed it out of the House. It needs to be passed out of the Senate. That addresses some of the loopholes in the disclosure of foreign dollars. One question I asked in the hearing that was not as widely reported, but I believe it was a very important question. These schools did not want to answer when I asked, lay out your largest sources of foreign dollars, and they kind of clammed up and they didn't want to talk about it. That to me highlighted that this is a major controversy and deserves more digging and investigation. We already know that Qatar is billions annually, but they can circumvent disclosure by giving to centers or particular professors. We want to make sure that those loopholes are closed. So pass the Deterrent Act in the Senate, get it signed into law. And we've already seen that the Department of Education publishing those findings. Transparency is so important in terms of increasing awareness across the country. The other piece is I would do a strict, and this is the position of Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, I would not allow certain funds from certain countries at all to go in our higher ed institutions. These are multi-billion-dollar endowments. Why are we allowing that to happen? It's not just an issue that has led to anti-Semitism. If you look at the CCP, for example, they funded what are called Confucius Institutes for a number of years that we worked to shut down in Congress, but they're now trying to use other ways to get our funding. And then I think capping foreign students is very important. These schools are American institutions. They're trying to view themselves as global ones, but they are American institutions. They need to prioritize American students. Having a 15% cap per institution is common sense and frankly the bare minimum that we should do to prioritize American students, because as we saw at Columbia, most notably, many of the organizers of the pro-Hamas encampment were those foreign students, including Mahmoud Khalil, and you can make a direct line from what happened at Columbia to the New York City mayor's race in terms of electing and the boots on the ground for the socialist mayor of New York.
We've spoken about it before, and one of the other things that we can do is go after their 501c3 status, because if you are getting tax benefits, you have to make sure that those institutions that are receiving those dollar breaks off of their whatever it is at the end of the year, that they are able to protect the students that they're there to protect. And so just like 501c3s can't be political or can't raise funds for other specific causes, we need to make sure that we're protecting the integrity of the organizations, where those dollars are going, and those that don't deserve the tax break should be paying their taxes just like everybody else.
Absolutely. All of these tools need to be on the table. And what I found is that, again, these schools had an opportunity to fix themselves. They failed. They didn't get it. They are not capable of fixing themselves. It needs to be outside pressure, using every tool in the toolkit to help turn this in a more positive direction to save higher education. Because this issue, Tila, is anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine for anti-Americanism and attacks on Western civilization. This is attacking our fundamental values, and this is why that hearing mattered to so many Americans, many of whom are not Jewish Americans, who said enough is enough. This hearing is just so far outside the bounds of what our moral values are.
From what I'm hearing, the poison in the poison ivies of the title of your book, the poison is the outside funding, the poison is the political agendas, the progressive agendas that are actually fighting what education is meant to be about, an exchange of ideas and not an exchange of certain positions that people are trying to take. So when people read this book, Poison Ivies, what's the one message that you hope they walk away with?
I wrote this book because it's not only important for today, I believe this will be an important book historically, and I was fearful that the traditional media would brush this under the rug as only a few instances at a few universities. It was systemic, and it was much more than a few instances. To have it in one volume it's deeply disturbing. It is a challenging read in that respect because it just goes chapter and verse through what these students faced on these campuses. And it also highlights these incredible students. I mean, think about it. These were 18, 19, 20-year-olds who testified in front of Congress, who were essentially the whistleblowers. Think about, when we were all that age, to have that strength to speak out on not just a national but an international stage and testify in front of the United States Congress. That extraordinary courage and bravery was incredibly important and delivered these results. So the book highlights those positive examples of strong leaders as well. But it's an important book, not just for today in higher ed, but it will be important historically as we look back at this moment in higher education and what we as fellow Americans did to solve this.
I also feel like you're documenting a moment in time, and you know who the good actors were and who the bad actors are and will be in history. And history, people tend to rewrite history, and it's his story, but we're getting the story from you. And the facts matter, and the truth matters. Lastly, I just want to say, all of you have access to her book. There are 50 copies that will be available, signed by our Congresswoman. They will be handed out to the first 50 people that come here. Take the opportunity to not just read it, but read it and pass it on. It's a message that our students deserve to be spread. Our children deserve better than what they're getting in these institutions. These young adults are not just brave, they've worked really hard their entire lives to get to these institutions, to have the ability and have access, as you did as a first-generation student at an Ivy League university. We owe them the support, we owe them the protection, and thanks to you, I feel like the trend will be moving in that direction, and they will be safer thanks to you, this book, and everything that you've done to protect them. So thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you all for listening. Make sure you get a copy of Poison Ivy. Buy them for your friends, for your neighbors, and everybody that you know.
Thank you, Tila.